Howdy, guys. Hope you're doing well. That was my little intro to the Frontier Trail Ride music. So, we're going to be talking about the Frontier unit, but I just want to reflect a little bit on last week. So, last week we talked about Reconstruction, and I wanted to thank you guys for participating in those discussion questions. I had a lot of awesome answers. But for those of you that did not go back and check, I did comment on all of your posts, especially on number 13, which was the Friday's discussion question, which had you guys ask a lot of questions. I answered those questions if you had them, so make sure you go back and check those out. But this week we're going to move on to the Frontier unit. The Frontier is the part of Texas and the part of the West that wasn't highly explored. So these people were living out on their own, had very few people around them, and they had to make their way of life. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, is what that life was like during that time period. So the two main things that we're going to be talking about this week and that you need to be able to do by the end of this week is identify significant individuals, events, and issues, including the development of the cattle industry from the Spanish beginnings and the cowboy way of life. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is how it began with the Spanish bringing cattle to Texas and the cowboy way of life. Next, we're going to be talking about defining and tracing the impact of the boom and bust cycles of the leading Texas industries throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, such as farming. So we're going to be talking about farming as well this week. So a little history behind the cattle trails. The Spanish settlers brought the first cattle to Texas. When they were driven out of Texas, many of those cattle were let loose, and they didn't bring them back to Spain with them. And so there ended up being a breeding population of cattle in Texas that were wild until they were brought back under domestication and used for human use. So the first thing I want to show you guys is the cattle. This is not what they looked like, but it is an easy way to remember that the Spanish brought the cattle. The cows they actually brought were longhorns, not this cow right here with the luscious locks that he has. And so they brought cattle over in the late 1600s. Spanish friars eventually introduced what is known as cattle ranching in the 1730s. That means they domesticate the cattle, they make them usable and more easy to control, and then they use them obviously for meat and milk and other things that cows are used for. So the Spanish friars introduced cattle ranching in the 1730s. There are four major cattle routes, cattle trails that came from the south part of Texas and south part of the United States and went up into the Midwest of the United States and got on train routes or railroads, and they would go west to Sacramento and San Francisco, California, or east to Chicago, and then beyond to the East Coast as well. So the four main routes are the Chisholm Trail, which is going to be a yellow one on this map, the Western Trail, which is the red one on this map, the Shawnee Trail, which is the green one on this map that I'm about to show you, and then the Goodnight Loving Trail is on the map, and it is purple. So those four trails I'm going to show you right now. So let's check that out. So here's the four that we were talking about. So we have the Goodnight Loving Trail right here is this purple one. It starts in Fort Griffin and goes through Fort Concho, eventually crosses the Pecos River, and then follows the Pecos River through the New Mexican Territory and up into Colorado Territory as well. Gets on the train in Denver. For those cows and those ranchers that didn't stop in Denver, they could go up to Cheyenne, Wyoming as well, or they could just drop them off in Denver and take the train that way. But there were two major stops, Denver and Cheyenne. To the west, they could take this train and it'd go to Sacramento and San Francisco, or they could go through Ogallala, Nebraska, and take it going east to Chicago or to the East Coast further beyond. So that's the first trail that we're going to talk about, is that Goodnight Loving Trail. So it was named after two men that found the trail and that pioneered it. Goodnight and Loving were their last names. The next trail we're going to talk about is the red one right here, which is the Western Trail. The reason why it's called the Western Trail is because it went to the western part of Texas and would go to the west coast. So it started down at the bottom right here around King's Ranch, which we'll talk about, which is the largest ranch in Texas, but it started a little bit north of that, and it went up through Austin, and then Coleman, Fort Griffin as well, like the Goodnight Loving Trail started, crosses the Red River through Indian Territory, eventually got into Dodge City, Kansas, and could board that train and go up towards Denver and Cheyenne, or if they didn't stop there, they would continue up to Ogallala, Nebraska, and that would go west towards Sacramento and San Francisco, or east towards Chicago as well. Our next trail is this yellow one, which you remember is the Chisholm Trail. The Chisholm Trail started, like I mentioned before, the King Ranch, which is one of the two major ranches in Texas at the time. The other one was XIT Ranch. XIT Ranch no longer exists in Texas, but the King Ranch does. So it started down here in the south. It'd go up through San Antonio and Austin and Waco, and then would fork at Waco and go up through Fort Worth, which is where the Fort Worth Stockyards are, a major stopping point along these trails, and you can still visit it today. It's a historic site in Texas. It'd cross the Red River, go through Indian Territory as well, which is now Oklahoma. It could either go through Caldwell and Wichita into Abilene, Kansas, or go west in the left fork and go through Ellsworth and go to Denver, or go east through Kansas City and Sedalia up to Chicago, or to the East Coast through St. Louis. So there are many different ways, but the main thing is that they were going from the south of Texas and the south of the United States and up to the north of the United States to take them west or east on those trails. Our last trail is this green one right here that started down here in Brownsville, and it was called the Shawnee Trail, named after the Shawnee Native Americans. And so this Shawnee Trail, like I said, started in Brownsville, down here at the bottom. It'd go up through and go around San Antonio and through Austin, and then Waco, and instead of going west, like this yellow trail did, it'd go east through Dallas, up across the Red River and Indian Territory as well, and then could either go to Kansas City, Missouri, or Sedalia, Missouri. And either way, it could go west towards San Francisco and Sacramento, or east through Chicago, or east through St. Louis, and eventually to the East Coast. So those are our four main trails that we are going to be talking about. So like I said, there are the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, the Shawnee Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail are the four that started in Texas, went up to the north and the Midwest of the United States, would either go west to San Francisco and Sacramento, or east to Chicago, or through St. Louis and get to the East Coast. So the first thing I want to tell you about is these trails didn't last very long, only about 20 years. From the 1860s or the 1880s as these cattle drives existed. Very few of them started or went after 1880s, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But they didn't start till about the 1860s because people didn't need or didn't have a way of getting from the south of Texas, where all these cows were, to the west coast or the east coast. Once the railroads were built, they were able to take it. So you weren't going to walk your cows from Texas all the way to California, or from Texas all the way to the East Coast in New York. So the railroads helped with this. So when those started to be built and brought out west, they were able to bring their cows to the railroads, and then the railroads could take them west and east to where they needed to be. And so that's why it didn't start till about the 1860s, because that's when the railroads finally got that far out. So why did it end so abruptly in the 1880s? It was working really well. People really enjoyed it. People on the West Coast and the East Coast could get fresh beef and fresh cattle if they needed it, but they stopped it because more railroads were built. Eventually, you didn't have to walk, thousands of miles from South Texas and Brownsville all the way up to Ogallala, Nebraska. It took a long time. It took months at a time to do that, and so they stopped doing it because more railroads were built. More of the railroads started coming down into Texas. Some came through Fort Worth. That's where the Fort Worth Stockyards come in. They started to come south, and so instead of having to drive them, hundreds or thousands of miles north, they would stop right, in the town where the cows were being raised, and so you didn't have to do the cow drives anymore. And so this is not what, it looked like when the cows were put on there, but this is just a kind of an interesting gift to talk about. So this is in India, people riding on a train, but they would stuff the cows in there pretty tight to fit as many as possible. So that's one of the reasons why the cattle industry stopped using cattle trails, is because more railroads were built. A second reason why the cattle industry stopped is the invention of barbed wire. So most of the time when you think of barbed wire, you think of, maybe on prison fences. It keeps people from getting out. You might see it in a cattle ranch or a farm to keep animals from getting in and their animals from getting out. But at the time, farmers were the ones that used barbed wire. They didn't use it to keep their cows in, they used it to keep cows out. And so when the invention of barbed wire happened and all these farmers started shutting off their land to the cattle trails, they could no longer make it through. It was a maze to get through. So they'd come to a farm, they'd get stopped by a barbed wire. Instead of having to, go through it like they had before, they had to go all the way around it if they could go around it. And so that kind of stopped the cattle industry from using cattle trails as well, because they now had to make their way through that maze and weave through it rather than going straight like they had before. So the invention of barbed wire, which we'll talk about later this week, also led to the cattle industry stopping the use of cattle trails. Another third reason is quarantine laws kept Texas cattle from crossing into many states. There was a time period in the the early 1880s where Texas cattle had a disease that they were spreading to cows in Oklahoma and Kansas. And so they wanted to keep that disease from spreading to the cows up there. And so they said that Texas cows were no longer allowed to leave Texas. And so that quarantine on Texas also stopped the spread of that disease, but it also stopped the spread of cattle trails. And so low prices of cattle meant it was too costly and too expensive to drive the cows up from Texas into Kansas and Nebraska and Wyoming and Colorado. So farmers and ranchers in the other states blocked trails to prevent Texas longhorns from infecting their cattle was part of that quarantine as well. So there's no more ranching done in Texas and taken up to Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska and Colorado, because all of the ranching was now being done in Texas, and then trains were coming through Texas and taking them to those two places. So that's really the end of this video. Make sure you guys comment on the discussion questions. You do the practice quiz that's on there. It's not a grade. Have a good rest of your week, guys. Thanks.